Snow swept across a frozen Soviet airfield in the winter of 1943. The wind cut through the steel ribs of abandoned hangars. Engines coughed, sputtered, and died in the cold. But one sound broke through a deep, throaty hum, followed by the clatter of machine guns test-firing into the dawn. A pilot in a heavy leather jacket climbed down from a stubby, odd-looking plane. The engine sat not in front of him, but behind the cockpit. The nose was short, housing a cannon that looked far too large for such a compact machine. He patted the metal skin and muttered, in Russian, "My American snake, my cobra." It was a Bell P-39 Airacobra, a fighter most American pilots had laughed at. To them, it was a flawed, underpowered death trap. But here, in the snows of the Eastern Front, it was a hero. How could the same machine be despised in one nation and worshipped in another? That's what we're about to find out. Because the Airacobra's story isn't just about engineering. It's about pride, politics, and how a failed American fighter became the deadliest Soviet secret of the war. But first, to understand why America rejected it, we need to go back to where it all began. The P-39 was born in a fever of innovation. In 1937, Bell Aircraft promised something revolutionary, a fighter unlike any other in the world. The engine would sit behind the pilot. The nose would be free to carry a 37mm cannon, powerful enough to shred bombers with a single shot. It had tricycle landing gear, unheard of in the 30s, and a sleek, aerodynamic shape. Test pilots called it strange but promising. The Army wanted altitude and speed. Bell promised both thanks to a turbo supercharger that could keep power above 30,000 feet. But then came the first mistake. To simplify production, the US Army removed that turbo supercharger. Suddenly, the P-39 lost its edge. It struggled above 12,000 feet, exactly where bomber escorts were supposed to fly. American pilots mocked it. They said it climbed like a brick, overheated easily, and was deadly to fly. If the engine quit, the long drive shaft under the cockpit could shatter, turning into shrapnel. In a world chasing altitude records, the Airacobra was a low-level brawler, and no one wanted that. Still, production continued. America had invested too much to quit. Thousands rolled off the line, and thousands sat idle. The fighter that was supposed to change everything became a symbol of disappointment. But across the Atlantic, another nation was about to see something very different in this odd machine. Spring 1941. Britain was desperate for fighters. The Battle of Britain had ended, but the Luftwaffe still prowled the skies. When the Americans offered their new Airacobra, the Royal Air Force said yes, anything to fill the gaps. The first batch of P-39 seconds arrived by sea, painted in olive drab, their sleek lines promising hope. But the hope didn't last long. British test pilots took them aloft over southern England and came back shaking their heads. At altitude, the Airacobra gasped for air. Its Allison engine, robbed of its turbo supercharger, simply couldn't climb with the German Messerschmitt 109 seconds. "It's a splendid aircraft," one RAF pilot said dryly, "as long as the enemy stays below 10,000 feet. In combat trials, the Cobra couldn't catch bombers. Its engine overheated, its dive unstable. The British were polite but blunt, unsuitable for European operations. So they grounded it. Dozens of P-39 seconds were pushed into storage, some stripped for parts, others sold back across the Atlantic. The RAF pilots nicknamed it the Iron Dog, heavy, unpredictable, and untrustworthy. The American press never reported the fiasco. Bell Aircraft quietly buried the criticism and pushed new orders through Washington. But now, warehouses were filling with planes nobody wanted to fly, and that's when someone unexpected came knocking. A quiet request, coded in Lend-Lease paperwork, marked simply, "Transfer to Soviet Union." At first, US officers laughed. The Soviets? What would they do with rejected fighters that couldn't climb? But the Red Air Force wasn't looking for high-altitude duels. They were fighting a very different war, one that raged just above the trees, autumn 1942. The Eastern Front was burning. German Stukas, Focke-Wulfs, and Messerschmitts ruled the skies at dawn, strafing Soviet columns and bombing bridges before vanishing into the clouds. The Red Air Force was bleeding, outnumbered, outgunned, and flying outdated machines. When the first shipment of P-39 Airacobras arrived from America, crated and packed in Greece, Soviet mechanics pried them open like treasure chests. To their surprise, the parts were well made, the engines clean, the guns powerful. They assembled the planes in freezing warehouses, painted red stars over the American insignia, and rolled them out onto rough, muddy runways. The first flight stunned everyone. At low altitude below 15,000 feet, the Airacobra was a beast. The nose-mounted 37mm cannon punched through German fighters in a single hit. Its tricycle landing gear made it easy to handle on rough Soviet fields. And that mid-engine design? It balanced the plane beautifully in tight turns. Soviet engineers tore out unnecessary radio gear, reduced weight, and optimized the engines for quick takeoffs and aggressive climbs, perfect for ambushes and close support. The American manuals called the plane temperamental. The Soviets called it udobnaya, comfortable. It became the favorite of frontline pilots almost overnight. Where Americans saw a floor, low ceiling, limited range, the Soviets saw efficiency. Their battles were not fought above the clouds. They were fought in the dirt, over trenches, tanks, and frozen rivers. One Soviet report summed it up simply: "We do not fight at altitude, we fight for the ground." And for that fight, the Airacobra was perfect. What America considered an embarrassment was about to become the Soviet Union's most beloved warbird. It didn't take long for the Cobra to make legends. By 1943, Soviet aces were rewriting the rules of air combat, and they were doing it in American-built P-39 seconds. One name stood above them all: Aleksandr Pokryshkin. A former metalworker turned fighter pilot, Pokryshkin flew the P-39 like it was part of him. He scored more than 40 of his official victories in the Airacobra, a machine most American commanders had written off. Pokryshkin said it plainly: "The Cobra suited us like no other. It was steady in a dive, powerful in a turn, and she always came home." He and his fellow pilots learned the aircraft's personality, her balance, her torque, her quirks. The heavy cannon in the nose gave her a distinct feel. You didn't spray and pray, you waited, lined up the shot, and when you fired, it was final. A single shell could snap a Messerschmitt's wing clean off. The Soviets developed new tactics around it. Instead of climbing duels, they ambushed from low-altitude quick bursts, tight loops, outturning German fighters that expected easy kills. In the chaos of low-level combat, precision and discipline mattered more than sheer speed. Pokryshkin's squadron became so lethal that the Luftwaffe issued warnings: "Beware the Cobras of the Kuban." To German pilots, it was a cruel irony. The very planes they dismissed as inferior in Western skies were cutting them down over the Black Sea. And Pokryshkin wasn't alone. Pilots like Grigoriy Rechkalov and Nikolai Golodnikov joined him, each racking up dozens of kills. Many of the Soviet Union's top 10 aces men, with over 40 confirmed victories, flew 39 seconds. They called it the snake that strikes low. The Americans had sent the Airacobra to the Soviets as a kind of consolation prize. Instead, it became the backbone of their fighter force. A misunderstood export turned into the engine of Soviet air supremacy. But behind the scenes, something more political was happening, something the world wasn't supposed to see. Officially, the Soviet press said almost nothing about the P-39. Newspapers praised Soviet heroism, Soviet skill, and Soviet industry, but rarely mentioned that many of their top pilots were flying American-built planes. Behind the curtain, though, the truth was impossible to hide. Soviet engineers privately raved about the Airacobra's handling. Its Allison engine ran clean on Soviet fuel. Its tricycle gear allowed takeoffs from mud-soaked fields where Yakovlev and Lavochkin fighters struggled. Internal reports to Moscow begged for more. Request increased deliveries of Airacobra aircraft, superior stability, good guns, easy to repair. But Stalin's regime had an image to protect. They couldn't allow the public to think American technology was superior. So they quietly continued requesting the planes through Lend-Lease, while propaganda posters showed Soviet-built yaks and LAS soaring heroically into the sky. Even Pokryshkin's beloved Cobra was officially airbrushed from photos, replaced with domestic models to preserve national pride. In one Soviet newsreel, Pokryshkin was shown beside a yak, though eyewitnesses knew he had flown his P-39 that very morning. Meanwhile, in the West, the story was equally muted. American media never publicized how well the Airacobra performed in Soviet hands. To admit that the failed US fighter had become a hero in Russia would have been awkward. So both sides stayed silent for opposite reasons. For America, it was embarrassment. For the Soviets, it was secrecy. Yet the frontline pilots didn't care about politics. They gave their Cobras names: Devil's Fang, White Death, Little Snake. They decorated them with personal insignia and flew them until the rivets shone silver from frost and gun smoke. To them, this wasn't an American plane. It was their plane, the one that survived the cold, the mud, and the chaos. And every time a German formation appeared over the steppe, those Cobras rose to meet them, low, fast, and deadly. But there was still one question historians would ask decades later. Was the P-39 really a bad design, or was it just used in the wrong war? The irony of the P-39 Airacobra is that it was never truly bad, only misplaced. It was designed for a kind of air war America never actually fought. When Bell engineers first conceived it, they built the airframe around a turbocharged engine meant to keep power at high altitude. But when the U.S. Army removed that turbocharger to cut costs, everything changed. The plane was left gasping above 12,000 feet, the very ceiling where American bombers needed escort. To American commanders, that made it useless, but to Soviet pilots fighting ground-level dogfights, it made it perfect. That mid-engine layout everyone mocked? It gave the plane a near-perfect center of gravity, allowing insane rolls and tight turns at treetop height. The nose-mounted cannon, too heavy for accuracy, according to U.S. evaluators, was exactly what Soviet pilots wanted for one-shot kills. The tricycle landing gear made it easy to operate from muddy fields and snowbound strips, a luxury their domestic planes didn't have. The P-39 was a paradox, ahead of its time in concept, crippled by compromise in production. It was meant to pioneer a new age of balanced fighters, with the firepower and stability that later defined the jet era. But stripped of its supercharger, it was dismissed before it could prove itself. American pilots said it handled like a brick with wings. Soviet pilots said it handled like a scalpel. Same aircraft, two philosophies colliding. The US saw air superiority as a matter of altitude, speed, and escort endurance. The USSR saw it as a knife fight, fast, close, and lethal. And in that knife fight, the P-39's supposed flaws turned into advantages. The more the Americans mocked it, the more the Soviets mastered it. By 1944, Soviet squadrons were requesting Cobras by name, rejecting the newer P-47 seconds and even some P-51 seconds offered through Lend-Lease. They wanted the plane that felt alive in their hands. The misunderstood misfit had found its home, but its legend was about to grow even further, not through engineers or generals, but through combat stories that German pilots would never forget. By 1943, the German Luftwaffe had a problem it didn't expect. Their experienced aces were being hunted not by Spitfires or Thunderbolts, but by low-flying, snake-nosed Cobras. German pilots started reporting strange encounters over the Kuban and Kursk fronts. They'd spot a lone dot below the clouds, dive in for the kill, and suddenly find tracers ripping through their wings before they could react. They called it the snake's bite. In reality, it was the P-39 Airacobra, flown by Soviet masters like Pokryshkin, Gulayev, and Rechkalov. Their tactics were unlike anything the Luftwaffe had trained for. Instead of climbing duels, they staged low ambushes, using trees, rivers, and terrain to hide their approach. They fired that 37mm cannon only once or twice per pass, no waste, no mercy. One Luftwaffe pilot, interviewed years later, admitted, "They attacked from nowhere. We thought we were hunting and suddenly we were the prey." Pokryshkin's unit, flying mostly P-39 seconds, scored over 600 confirmed victories in just a few months. His personal record 59 made him one of the top Allied aces of the war, and his rival, Rechkalov, nearly matched him shot for shot, also in an Airacobra. The Germans quickly learned to fear that distinctive silhouette. At first, they mistook it for the new American P-51 Mustang until they realized it was something slower, smaller, but far deadlier at low level. They started radioing warnings, "Achtung, Cobra, Cobra low." In some sectors, Luftwaffe Command even changed patrol altitudes, avoiding the low-level zones where these Cobra packs operated. The hunters had become the hunted. It was the ultimate irony. The same fighter that American test pilots ridiculed as not worth the fuel was tearing through Germany's best on the Eastern Front. The Airacobra's reputation in the West never recovered. But in the East, its legend was sealed in fire, smoke, and shattered wings. Yet when the war finally ended, that legend would vanish almost overnight, buried by politics, pride, and time. May 1945. The war was ending. The skies above Europe were quiet now, and thousands of aircraft sat idle on muddy airfields. Among them, hundreds of P-39 Airacobras, some worn to the bone, others still gleaming, their gun barrels scorched from endless combat. Soviet mechanics cleaned them one last time. Pilots stood for photographs beside their snakes. Some kissed the metal, whispering words of thanks. Others left small painted inscriptions on the fuselage, a date, a name, a victory tally. They knew they'd never fly these machines again. When peace came, the Airacobra disappeared as suddenly as it had risen. The United States scrapped its remaining stock, embarrassed by what it considered an obsolete design. Bell Aircraft moved on to new jet projects, quietly erasing the Airacobra from company brochures. To them, it was a dead end, a failed experiment that had tarnished their reputation. In the Soviet Union, the story was more complex. The P-39 had saved lives, won battles, and trained generations of pilots, yet official history gave it barely a mention. Why? Because acknowledging its American origin didn't fit the narrative of Soviet self-reliance. For decades, the veterans kept the memory alive themselves. At reunions in Moscow and Novosibirsk, they spoke fondly of our Cobra. They told stories of duels over the Kuban, of how the plane could flip on its side in a heartbeat, of how its cannon barked once, and that was enough. They remembered how it felt to trust a foreign machine more than their own. Historians today have finally started to set the record straight. The Airacobra, they say, wasn't a failure at all. It was ahead of its time. Its mid-engine balance, tricycle landing gear, and nose-mounted cannon were design principles that would later define the jet age. The P-39 was a bridge between the piston and the jet, between two doctrines, between two worlds. It fought in the shadows of giants, yet in the right hands it was every bit their equal. But history isn't kind to misfits. In America, the Airacobra remains a forgotten chapter, a machine most people know only as the one that didn't work. In Russia, it's a ghost remembered by a generation that's almost gone. Still, somewhere in a museum outside Moscow, one P-39 stands polished and silent, a faded red star on its wing. A small plaque beneath it reads simply, Bell P-39 Airacobra, Defender of the Motherland. And if you listen closely, through the hum of distant engines and the whispers of time, you can almost hear Pokryshkin's words again, soft, proud, untranslatable, except in tone. The Cobra was our friend. She defended our skies. The Airacobra's story is one of contradictions. To the Americans, it was a disappointment, an aircraft that failed to meet expectations. To the Soviets, it was a savior, a fighter that gave them the edge when they needed it most. Same machine, two wars, two truths. History, it turns out, isn't written by the victors. It's rewritten by those who flew.